When most people think of addiction, they picture a personal failure, a breakdown of willpower, a lack of discipline, or even a moral defect. It's easy to assume that if someone just tried harder, they could stop. But this view is not only simplistic, it's deeply flawed. Beneath every addiction, there's not just a bad habit, but a story, a wound, a cry for meaning that hasn't been answered. Carl Jung, one of the most profound explorers of the human psyche, believed that addiction wasn't a defect. It was a failed attempt at transformation. To him, the addict wasn't simply chasing pleasure. They were chasing something sacred, something lost. In Jung's view, the addicted individual had become disconnected from their inner center, from that deep symbolic core that gives life its orientation. And until that connection was restored, no amount of willpower would ever be enough. In words often attributed to Jung, no addict truly heals unless they have a spiritual experience. And this isn't about religion, it's about meaning. Jung saw that addiction isn't about the substance, it's about the absence, the alcohol, the drugs, the compulsive behavior. These are just placeholders, substitutes for something much deeper, the longing for connection, for wholeness, for self-acceptance, for transcendence. Most addicts don't know exactly what they're searching for. They only feel a constant internal ache, an undefined emptiness that gnaws at the edges of their awareness. That ache drives them to find relief anywhere they can. Whether it's alcohol, sex, gambling, food, work, or social media, the pattern is the same. Something external is used to quiet something internal. It works, for a while. The drink numbs the pain. The binge soothes the anxiety. The high fills the void. But then it ends, and the ache returns louder than before. This cycle isn't about weakness. It's about misalignment between what the soul truly needs and what the person is trying to use to fill that need. In ancient societies, many of the same substances we now use to numb were used to awaken. Psychedelics, fasting, dancing, even silence were tools for spiritual rituals. They weren't meant to escape reality, but to deepen one's contact with it. But today, in a world stripped of symbolism, where ritual has been replaced with routine, and spirituality has been replaced with stimulation, those same tools have become traps. The modern addict, Jung might say, is unconsciously reaching for a transcendence they've been taught to deny. The tragedy is that, in reaching for it through substances, they move further from what they seek. Jung warned us, the soul cannot live on reason alone. It needs images, myths, symbols, not as distractions, but as maps to navigate the inner world. When those are lost, the psyche begins to deteriorate, and when the soul gets sick, it tries to heal. Sometimes, that attempt takes the form of addiction. This is why Jung's influence shaped early recovery movements like Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, was directly inspired by a letter from Jung in which Jung explained, recovery isn't about discipline, it's about transformation, not behavior change, but inner rebirth. For Jung, addiction was a spiritual emergency, a call from the unconscious that something vital was missing, that the person had been living disconnected from a part of themselves so essential that its absence became unbearable. But here's the paradox. In that very desperation lies potential. The pain of addiction is not just suffering. It's evidence that something inside still wants to live, that something within still hopes for healing, for meaning. And it's that hope, buried beneath the pain, that makes real transformation possible. Addiction, from this perspective, is not the enemy. It's a misdirected compass, pointing not to ruin, but to a deeper need left unresolved. When someone says they want to be free from addiction, what they often mean, without knowing it, is that they want to feel whole again, to feel alive in a way that doesn't depend on a chemical or a behavior. But that kind of freedom doesn't come from force. It comes from understanding, from slowing down enough to ask, not what's wrong with me, but what is this pain trying to tell me? For Jung, every symptom is a message. Every compulsion, a clue. Every addiction, a story trying to surface. The soul doesn't speak in words. It speaks in patterns. It speaks through anxiety, through obsession, through longing. And until we learn how to listen, we keep treating the symptom while ignoring the source. If addiction is the symptom, what's the source? Carl Jung would point us not toward the substance, but toward what lies beneath, the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not a monster. It's not evil. It's simply everything you've repressed, denied, or disowned in order to survive in a world that rewards conformity. It's the rage you weren't allowed to express, the grief you were told to swallow, the longing for love that got shut down when you were young and vulnerable. The shadow is personal, powerful, and very, very real. For an addict, the substance is often a way of avoiding that shadow, because looking at what's inside, the pain, the guilt, the shame, can feel unbearable. But here's the truth Jung knew well. What you don't consciously face will run your life from the dark. When someone uses, they're not just trying to get high. They're trying to silence something. They're numbing a voice that keeps whispering, "You're not enough," or "You're unlovable," or "You're too much." These aren't logical thoughts. They're emotional wounds, imprints left behind by years of internalized pain. The shadow doesn't go away just because we ignore it. In fact, the more we suppress it, the louder it gets. Not in words, but in behaviors we can't seem to control. That's why many addicts feel like there's a part of them acting on its own, hijacking their willpower. That part is the shadow demanding to be seen. You can go to rehab, detox, switch to healthier routines. But if the shadow isn't integrated, the pattern will return. Maybe not in the same form, maybe not heroin or alcohol, but maybe in compulsive relationships, overworking, obsessive perfectionism. It's the same root, just in a new disguise. Jung didn't believe in quick fixes. He believed in deep work. And the deepest work begins when we turn toward the shadow instead of running from it. This means asking uncomfortable questions. What part of myself am I afraid to feel? What truth have I spent years denying? What wound have I tried to numb instead of heal? Addiction is often the result of an internal war. One part of the self is desperate to be seen, to be heard, to express. Another part, the part conditioned to stay in control, tries to shut it down. This war generates tremendous tension, anxiety, and exhaustion. Eventually, something has to give. The addict reaches for relief, not out of weakness, but out of psychic overload. This inner conflict is rarely conscious. Most people don't even know they're fighting themselves. They blame the environment, the triggers, the stress. But the true battle is internal. A part of them longs to scream. Another part insists on staying silent. One wants to break down and cry. The other demands composure and strength. Over time, that tension becomes unbearable. The body carries it. The nervous system is fried. And in that fragile state, the cycle of addiction begins again. Not as a choice, but as a coping mechanism. Jung saw this clearly. Symptoms are not mistakes. They're messages. And addiction is one of the most potent messages the unconscious can send. The substance becomes a translator for everything the person cannot say aloud. I'm hurting. I feel worthless. I need help. But because the addict often doesn't have the language or the permission to speak these truths, the body speaks for them. Through cravings, through compulsions, through collapse. Integrating the shadow means learning to hear those messages before they become self-destruction. But make no mistake, this isn't easy. It requires immense courage to sit with the parts of yourself you've judged, shamed, or buried. It means revisiting trauma, facing loneliness, acknowledging rage. But only by doing so can you stop projecting those wounds onto the outside world. Because that's the next trap. When the shadow isn't faced, it gets projected. You start seeing the enemy out there, the toxic partner, the bad boss, the unfair system. But the real pain isn't out there, it's in here. And no amount of changing your job, your city, or your relationship will fix what you haven't confronted within. Jung warned of this. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. For many addicts, their entire worldview becomes distorted by projection. They trust no one, they feel isolated, misunderstood, attacked. But often, those feelings are echoes of their own repressed pain. Pain they've never felt safe enough to process. The path forward isn't in blame, it's in ownership. Addiction recovery isn't just about stopping the behavior, it's about understanding its purpose. What role has the addiction been playing? What feelings has it been protecting you from? What identity has it allowed you to avoid? When you start answering these questions honestly, you stop seeing your addiction as the enemy. You start seeing it as a messenger, a distorted but legitimate cry for integration. Integration doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean you'll never feel cravings again or make mistakes. It means you're no longer at war with yourself. You can feel the grief without drowning. You can notice the anger without lashing out. You can sit in discomfort without needing to numb it away. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The gold is in the shadow." Because the same part of you that holds your pain also holds your power. In the buried trauma is your sensitivity. In the denied anger is your strength. In the forgotten sadness is your compassion. The shadow doesn't just hold wounds, it holds gifts. And those gifts only become available when you stop running and start listening. So far, we've explored addiction as a symptom of unresolved emotional pain and as a manifestation of the shadow. But Jung took it one step further. He believed that addiction, at its core, is a spiritual crisis. Not in the religious sense, but in the deeply human sense. A disconnection from meaning, from purpose, from the inner center that gives coherence to life. This might sound abstract, but for the addict, it feels brutally concrete. Because when you're caught in addiction, life feels hollow, empty. Nothing seems to satisfy. No high lasts. No relationship feels deep enough. No achievement feels like it matters. You can quit the substance, change the environment, go to therapy, but something still feels missing. That missing piece, Jung believed, is not outside of you. It's the symbolic center your soul has lost contact with. Every addiction, Jung wrote, is an unconscious spiritual thirst. And without addressing that thirst, no healing will be complete. Here's what Jung noticed in his clinical work. The patients who made the deepest, most lasting recoveries weren't necessarily the most disciplined. They were the ones who had undergone a spiritual transformation, a shift in how they saw themselves, the world, and their suffering. They had reconnected with something greater than their ego, something sacred. Jung wasn't talking about religion in the institutional sense. He was talking about the archetypal layer of the psyche, the part of us that seeks symbols, myths, and meaning as a way to organize our experience. And when this symbolic structure is lost or denied, the psyche begins to fragment. In modern culture, we've replaced myth with consumption. We no longer tell stories that help people understand their pain. We medicate it. We no longer create rituals to mark transformation. We commercialize it. The addict, Jung believed, is someone trying, desperately and unconsciously, to recover that sacred experience. But because society no longer provides a symbolic container for it, they reach for substances instead. Think about it. Many of the same substances used in addiction today, alcohol, psychedelics, even cannabis, were once used in ancient cultures for ritual purposes. Shamans drank to induce vision. Temples used incense to alter consciousness. Ceremonies used rhythm, fire, and plant medicine to dissolve the ego and initiate spiritual rebirth. But in modern use, these practices have been stripped of their context. There is no guide, no intention, no containment. So instead of leading to transcendence, the substance leads to fragmentation. The problem then is not the substance, it's the loss of the symbolic. This is where Jung's concept of inner alchemy comes in. Just like the alchemists of old tried to transform lead into gold, Jung believed that we are each called to transform our raw psychological material, our pain, our fear, our shame, into something radiant, meaningful, and whole. And the catalyst for that transformation is often suffering. When the addict hits rock bottom, something strange happens. The ego cracks, the mask shatters, the false self dies. And in that space of collapse, a door opens, a door to something deeper. A symbol may appear, a dream, an image, a word, a memory, that suddenly makes everything make sense. That symbol becomes a seed for healing. But here's the catch. The symbol can't be forced. It has to emerge from within. It has to be discovered, not prescribed. This is why so many addiction programs influenced by Jung, including Alcoholics Anonymous, place such emphasis on the concept of a higher power. It's not about doctrine. It's about helping the addict reorient their identity around something beyond the ego, something that restores a sense of order, connection, and transcendence. Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, once wrote to Jung asking for insight into addiction. Jung's response was profound. He explained that the craving for alcohol was actually a low-level substitute for a genuine spiritual experience. The thirst, he said, was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. Jung's solution? Not more discipline, not more shame, but spiritual experience. A real felt encounter with the numinous, that sense of awe, of presence, of being held by something greater than yourself. For some, that experience comes through nature. For others, through music, art, love, or even dreams. But always, it comes through symbolic reconnection. The feeling that your suffering is part of something meaningful, not meaningless. When this happens, the addict begins to see their addiction in a new light. Not as a curse, not as a moral failing, but as a call to awaken. This reframes everything. Instead of asking, how do I stop using? The question becomes, what is my soul really hungry for? Instead of, how do I escape this pain? It becomes, what is this pain trying to teach me? And with those new questions, the journey transforms. No longer a fight to suppress symptoms, but a path toward integration. Along this path, archetypes begin to surface. The wounded healer, the hero's journey, the death and rebirth. These aren't just stories. They're psychological maps. They provide orientation. They remind the person that suffering isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a transformation. In this sense, the addict is not broken. They're initiated, not by choice, but by necessity. Because only when the ego cracks does the deeper self have a chance to emerge. And that emergence is not clean. It's not linear. It's often messy, terrifying, and filled with doubt. But it's also sacred. Because the person is no longer running, no longer numbing. They're listening. They're grieving. They're remembering. They're creating a new story. One not built on shame, but on meaning. This is what Jung called individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole, not by eliminating their darkness, but by integrating it, by bringing the unconscious into consciousness, by making peace with their shadow and finding the gold within it. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung said, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the task of the recovering soul, to walk into their darkness with eyes open, not to conquer it, but to understand it, to ask the shadow, "What do you want from me?" and to listen for the answer. Because beneath every craving is a cry, beneath every relapse is a message, and beneath every addiction is a soul trying to come home. We've walked through the pain, we've entered the shadow, we've looked addiction in the eye and seen not a villain, but a wounded messenger, and we've begun to understand that healing doesn't come from suppression, it comes from transformation, from meaning, from the symbolic. But there's one more step, one more movement in the symphony of self-recovery. That step is integration. Integration is the process of taking everything that's been scattered, rejected, or buried, and making it part of the whole again. It is the final alchemy. Not to become someone else, but to fully become yourself, with nothing hidden, nothing denied, nothing unloved. For Jung, integration wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about becoming some sanitized version of a human being who never slips, never hurts, never falters. It was about becoming conscious, about holding contradictions in tension, about creating space for the full complexity of the human soul. The addict's journey is often described as a path from chaos to order. But it's not a straight line. It's a spiral. There are relapses, regressions, reopened wounds. But every loop of that spiral goes deeper. And with each descent, there is also the possibility of deeper truth. So what does integration actually look like? It begins when the addict stops defining themselves by their past. When they no longer say, "I am broken," but rather, "I am becoming." When they stop fearing their darkness and instead ask, "What gift is hiding here?" This shift happens quietly, gradually, a moment at a time. It might look like pausing before reacting, like choosing to feel instead of numb, like telling the truth when lying would be easier, like sitting with discomfort instead of reaching for a fix. These seem like small things, but they are radical acts of integration. Each one stitches a thread between the conscious and the unconscious, between the mask and the soul, between who you've been and who you're becoming. And in this stitching, something beautiful starts to form: inner freedom. Inner freedom is not the absence of pain. It's the ability to move through pain without being defined by it. It's the capacity to hold sorrow and still reach for joy, to feel fear and still act with courage, to know that you carry shadows, but also light. It's what happens when you stop running from your story and start rewriting it. Let's be clear, this isn't easy. The world often rewards performance, not presence. Numbness, not nuance. So integration requires rebellion. A soft, fierce rebellion. Against the pressure to be perfect. Against the shame of being human. Against the lie that your worth depends on your productivity, your sobriety, or your control. Integration says, you are not your addiction. You are not your trauma. You are not your worst mistake. You are the one who survived it, and who now gets to choose what comes next. But you don't do this alone. Jung understood that true transformation requires more than inner work. It requires relationship. Because so much of what broke us, broke in relationship. And so much of what heals us, heals through relationship. Not just romantic love, but friendship, community, witnessing. Being seen, known, and held without needing to perform, without needing to hide. That's why group work is so central in many recovery programs. It's not just about accountability, it's about mirroring. Seeing your own pain reflected in others, and realizing you're not alone. Feeling someone else's struggle, and learning compassion. Offering your story, and finding your voice. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation, not as isolation, but as connected authenticity. You become more yourself, not in separation from others, but in honest, vulnerable presence with them. And here's the paradox. The more you accept your imperfection, the more whole you become. The more you surrender control, the more power you reclaim. The more you integrate your shadow, the more light you carry. Because now, you're not at war with yourself. You've called a truce. You've stopped trying to exile the parts of you that were hurting, and instead, you've welcomed them home. This is where the addict transforms into the alchemist. The person who once sought escape now seeks expression. The one who feared their pain now speaks it with clarity. The one who hid in shame now walks in presence. And the wound, once unbearable, becomes a source of wisdom. Jung often spoke of the wounded healer, the one who heals not because they've never been hurt, but precisely because they've walked through their own darkness and returned with insight. The one who can say to others, "I know that place. You can survive it. And not just survive, but be reborn." This doesn't mean the pain disappears, but it means the pain is no longer meaningless. It becomes a compass. It becomes a teacher. It becomes a doorway. And on the other side of that doorway is a kind of peace that can't be faked. A grounded, embodied calm that isn't dependent on circumstances. That isn't conditional on approval. That isn't tied to success or image. It is the peace of knowing, I have faced myself, and I am still here. So what's the final message? That addiction is not the end. It is a beginning disguised as collapse. It is the soul's cry for depth in a world of distractions. It is the search for sacredness in a culture of numbness. And that search, no matter how messy, is holy. If you're walking this path, know that your struggle is not weakness. It is your soul trying to remember who you are. It is your pain trying to find its place in your story. It is your shadow asking not to be feared, but integrated. Carl Jung didn't offer simple answers. He offered courage. He offered a map, not to a destination, but to a process. And that process, if you follow it with honesty, humility, and heart, will not only help you heal, it will help you become someone who can hold space for others to heal too. Because in the end, what you've been searching for was never outside of you. It was waiting, quietly, patiently, in the center of your own being. Welcome.